thousands of miles away, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European nations had met to decide how to partition Africa. That meeting, he said, was known as the Scramble for Africa. But today, he declared firmly, those same powers will now decide to scram from Africa. This statement was heard with rapt attention by the audience. It was seized on by the foreign journalist, and the word "scram from Africa" soon blazed across the headlines of newspapers around the world. Then Mboya formally called on Kwame Nkrumah to open the conference. Fellow African freedom fighters, ladies and gentlemen, began Nkrumah. Then he stopped. My pride, he went on slowly, slowly, overflows at the sight of so large a number of African comrades in arms, who, imbued with the fervent desire to see Africa free, the first time in the history of our continent, he observed that the assembly in front of him marked the opening of a new epoch in the history of Africa. Never before, he said, has it been possible for so representative a gathering of African freedom fighters not only to come together, but to assemble in a free, independent African state for the purpose of planning for a final assault upon imperialism and colonialism. Then he set out his vision for the liberation and unity of the African continent. This coming together, he said, will evolve eventually into a union of African states, just as the original 13 American colonies have now developed into the 49 states constituting the American community. He praised the practice of Gandhi, who had led the campaign of peaceful civil disobedience in India. This focus on struggle through nonviolence had been emphasized in the earliest plans for the conference. The cause was just, Nkrumah pointed out, and wholly in consonance with the principles enunciated in the Charter of the United Nations. But Nkrumah also included a warning. Do not let us also forget that colonialism and imperialism may come to us yet in a different guise, not necessarily from Europe. This was heard in different ways by members of the audience. Everyone here knows that it means America, said the representatives of the New China News Agency confidently. Many Americans and Britons were equally convinced that Nkrumah was warning against Soviet, Chinese, or Egyptian designs. After 40 minutes, Nkrumah brought his address to a close on an emphatic note. All Africa shall be free in this our lifetime. He assured the audience. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence. He spoke clearly and firmly. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa, I salute you. There was thunderous applause. Joshua Nkomo, a freedom fighter from Southern Rhodesia was profoundly moved. Nkrumah, he said, was one of the most inspiring orators he had ever heard. Ezekiel Mfalele, a South African delegate who had been forced into exile and was now a lecturer at the Department of Extramural Studies at the University College, Ibadan, in Nigeria, was exhilarated. He noted that Nkrumah spoke with restrained impetuosity, as he warned the imperial powers to pack up voluntarily rather than be forced out. After Nkrumah's opening speech, messages were read loud from Nikita Khrushchev, a leader of the Soviet Union, from Zhou Enlai, the premier of the People's Republic of China, and from leaders in East Germany, Bulgaria, North Korea, Yugoslavia, and North Vietnam. There were also a message from Lord Listowel, the newly appointed British Governor General of Ghana, who in any case was sitting in the front row of the hall. No one would have guessed that for the past few months, civil servants in Whitehall had been communicating feverishly in cipher with the British colonial administrations in Africa, concerned about the prospect of the embarrassing political and security consequences in our territories. That might result from this subversive conference. There was brief consideration of a plan to prevent attendance by delegates from British colonies, but the idea was rejected in case it gave the impression that Britain was unsympathetic to African advance. No greeting arrived from the White House. This disappointed many of the delegates who were expecting American support, not only because the United States itself had struggled to overthrow colonial rule, but also because it had taken the side of Egypt against France, Britain, and Israel during the Suez Crisis. After Nkrumah's address, the conference agenda was presented. Public plenary sessions would be held in the mornings, at which the heads of delegations would speak. This would be followed in the afternoon by closed committee sessions. 5 committees were appointed with the task of studying special topics such as racism and discrimination. The organizing spirit of the conference was George Padmore, whose mark was on everything from the conference program to the format of the program and resolutions. After independence the year before, Nkrumah had asked Padmore to come to Ghana as his advisor on African affairs and to coordinate the activities in Ghana of Africa's freedom fighters. It proved a wise decision. In the judgment of Cameron Dodo, since Padmore knew everyone who was anyone in Africa or knew someone who knew them, just after the end of the Second World War, Padmore, in partnership with Nkrumah, had organized the 5th International Conference of the Pan-African Congress in the city of Manchester in Britain. That Congress had put a spotlight on the fact that although the war had been fought in the name of freedom, millions of people still lived under the yoke of colonial rule. But the AAPC in Accra was different because, for the first time, it took place in Africa. In the words of one Kenyan involved in the proceedings, it brought Pan-Africanism home. to make it clear that a new tradition had started, Nkrumah insisted on changing the label Pan-African to All African. Many of the African delegates faced obstacles getting to the conference. Noted Maida Springer. He helped them with information and doing whatever I was asked to do. Some of them, she recalled years later, were there with a price on their head. You know, we had somehow sneaked them out of the country. What was significant, she thought, was that Africans from East, West, North, and South were meeting for the first time. Some of them could have culture shock. They were so different from other Africans in terms of their approach, in terms of their language, in terms of attitudes. But the common denominator was that they were meeting in an African country. Some people had been contacted, but many recalled T. Ras Makonnen, a Guyanese-born Pan-Africanist who had moved to Ghana when it became independent. Just came. He said many people just came. People arrived from Unyasa land, now Malawi, by the Congo route and from all over. We will be rung up by the police at the frontier and told that some fellows had arrived. They would have no passport. And they would say simply, we've got no documents because this is our country. This is our land. What's all this about needing a passport? It was overwhelming. And it meant that we needed enlightened policemen on the frontiers who would know not to enforce the regulations too strictly. Mekonnen continued. The message of independence had gone out. The call had gone to near and far, and the various groups had just set out to come to Rome, Ghana. Wow. When they arrived, Mekonnen took care of them, arranging clothes when necessary and a place to sleep. For West Africans, he wrote in a later memo, it was relatively straightforward to find their way to Accra. But a number of the Southern African delegations he found had to be headed. Our couriers had to go to places like Lesotho and Zambia, then the British Protectorate of Northern Rhodesia, then the British Protectorate of Northern Rhodesia to help with passports. Among the delegates were prominent leaders of the resistance movement against the hated Central African Federation, also known as the Federation of Rhodesia and Unyasa land, which had been created by the British in 1953 as a way to preserve white settlers rule in Central Africa. They included Kenneth Kaunda of Northern Rhodesia, who went on to become the founding president of independent Zambia in 1964. Hastings Banda of Unyasa land, who became the premier of independent Malawi in the same year. Mr. Kanyama Kiume of Unyasa land, who became foreign minister in Malawi's first independent government, and Joshua Nkomo of Southern Rhodesia, who served as vice president of Zimbabwe from 1990 following majority rule in 1980. The arrangements for the conference were perfect, observed Kiume, and it was amazing to see how everything had been geared to increase our sense of unity and common purpose. Ghana seemed to be the political mecca of Africa. There was an atmosphere of free and fearless talk. he added, in which we argued, exchanged experience, and compared notes. Other freedom fighters included Dr. Felix Roland Momi of French-ruled Cameroon, who was the president of the Union of the People of Cameroon, UPC, A.R. Mohammed Babu of the British Protectorate of Zanzibar, and Franz Omar Fanon, a psychiatrist born on the French-ruled island of Martinique, who was the great-grandson of a slave. Fanon led a delegation of the National Liberation Front, FLN, which was fighting a bitter war for freedom in Algeria against its French colonizers. The FLN had set up a government in exile in Congo just a few months before. Eslander Robinson, the wife of the world-famous bass baritone singer and actor Paul Robeson, was there too. She was ecstatic to be in Accra. Africa, she exclaimed, is on our way. Her only regret was that Paul, now on a concert tour, could not be with her. The Robertsons, who were close friends of Nkrumah, identified closely and actively with Africa. Paul Robertson's father had been born into slavery on a plantation in North Carolina and traced his heritage to Nigeria. In my music, my plays, my films, declared Robertson in 1935, I want to carry always this central idea to be African. He said he was learning Swahili, Twi, and other African dialects. Robertson sent a telegram with warmest greetings to the AAPC, explaining that he was deeply disappointed to miss this historic conference. But soon, he said, he hoped to be on the soil of my beloved Africa. For now, he sent his heartfelt hopes for the success of the conference's deliberations, for the glorious future of the African peoples. The Soviet Union sent a team of observers led by Pigam A. Asimov, the principal the principal of Turkmen State University. It included Ivan I. Potekin, a scholar of African affairs who had previously spent time in Ghana and was warmly welcomed back. A large delegation from the United Arab Republic was led by Fuad Galal, the vice president of the Egyptian National Assembly, who was described by a journalist at the conference as a squat, powerful man who was everywhere, consulting, interpreting. There was a busy program of social events, including cocktail parties by individual delegations, official receptions, a visit to a tobacco factory, a Ghana-Guinea football game, film screenings and traditional dances. The United States Information Agency arranged a concert by Camilla Williams, a celebrated soprano on a tour of Africa. In 1946, he had been the first African-American soprano to sing with a major opera company when she made her debut with the New York City Opera, performing the lead in Madame Butterfly. These social events were ideal opportunities for the delegates to mingle and meet each other, and Nkrumah was the ideal host, although he himself was teetotal. He readily accepted a glass with alcohol, occasionally raising it to his lips, so that few people realized he was not drinking. Nkrumah's life was austere and disciplined. He fasted once a week and meditated daily. But he always sought to ensure that this side of his personality did not make others feel uncomfortable. For Lumumba, the conference was a previously undreamed of opportunity to meet the key thinkers all over Africa. He was frequently in the company of the medical doctors, Fanon and Momi, with whom he spoke in French. Many of the participants were impressed by Lumumba's energy and enthusiasm for the Pan-African ideal. He rapidly became one of the stars of the conference. For George Auser of the American Committee on Africa, ACOA, an organization that had been founded in 1953 to support the liberation of Africa, his meeting with Lumumba was memorable. We had a session with Lumumba about what his situation was at that time. He noted in a report for his organization, he was very live person, a real activist, a striking personality. Joshua Nkomo commented that Lumumba was an endless talker, passionate about his own country, but he added somewhat resentfully, he seemed completely uninterested in the rest of Africa. In the plenary session on the morning of the Tuesday, 9th December, it was Shirley Graham's turn to take the floor and to read out the speech of her husband, Dr. Webb Du Bois. He was too infirm to travel and had remained in the USSR, where they now lived. Graham was one of only 8 official women delegates. The small number bitterly disappointed Eslanda Robertson, but noticed Maida Springer with pleasure. The women, particularly the French-speaking women, were on fire. They talked about the social problems faced by women. They were burning questions, and these women raised them all. They were, education, employment, religious and marriage customs, and they annoyed some of the African men. There were some men, she added, who just couldn't quite cope with the articulateness of the women. In a couple of the small committee meetings, they tried to shout the women down. Mathe Ohande, who represented the Cameroon Women's Democratic Union, gave a speech in which she traced the struggle of women for independence and for their own rights. He was followed by Fanon, who was scheduled to speak on behalf of the FLN. Fanon walked slowly to the rostrum, dressed in a somber, pale-colored suit with a bright white shirt. He wore dark glasses as a shield against the glare of the sun streaming through the windows. He had resolved to use his speech at the AAPC as an opportunity for the very first time in public to make the case for using violence to resist colonialism. This would challenge the commitment to Ghanaian non-violence, which so far had been the hallmark of the conference. Usually, Fanon, clean and ascetic, spoke in a dispassionate and intellectual manner. But on this occasion, he gripped both sides of the lectern and leaned forward towards the audience. However, regrettable the use of violence, he insisted with emotion. It had to remain an option. He gave a disturbing account of the atrocities carried out against